In 2025, global risks to business will be driven by power vacuums and polarisation, conflict and political violence, and the double-edged sword of technological advancement. There is significant risk tied to the United States losing traction and disengaging from critical arenas and domains. A web of geopolitical red lines will require heightened vigilance from organisations. Trade warfare will squeeze global business amid competing policies and measures. Political violence in all its forms will become more frequent and overt. And the concentration of digital risk into centralised technological ecosystems will threaten disruption on a global scale. These are our top risks for the year ahead.
Former President Trump's election will bring significant changes to U.S. foreign and domestic policy. In terms of foreign policy, we expect the U.S. to return to a more unilateral, transactional, America first posture that increases tensions with U.S. partners and allies and increases confrontation of U.S. adversaries in the Middle East and Asia.
Uncertainty of the U.S. policy across the region is going to be a big question mark for 2025. We know that the U.S. has been perceived across the region by several countries as being less influential, less powerful.
I think that there's a lot of concern in India and the broader Asia Pacific about the reliability of the US as a partner or as an ally. I think the trends that have been noticed in the region are that the US is becoming more isolationist. Under Trump, there have been flashpoints with respect to trade and immigration that were there during his first presidency and are likely to come back during the second presidency as well.
I tend to think of multiple Trump scenarios based on what we saw in the first Trump administration, which was at times the most hawkish policies on things like China trade, North Korea, and at other times some of the biggest attempts at negotiation and deal making. So it's really an increase in uncertainty and the spectrum of possibilities.
For Ukraine and Europe, the election of Donald Trump places the focus on his promise to making a deal to end the war. However, the preconditions necessary for Ukraine and Russia to start peace negotiations are simply not there. The main concern in Ukraine is that the US will force it to accept a deal on unfavorable terms and without the necessary security guarantees, such as a clear path to access NATO. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has begun adopting a transactional approach when engaging with Donald Trump, and the change in the form or scale of US military assistance going into Ukraine, rather than a complete halt, is more likely. The economic costs of supporting Ukraine will fall mostly on EU countries and the UK. In the year ahead, they will face mounting pressure to make costly political decisions, such as acting or not as Ukraine's security guarantor.
Under President Trump, companies need to prepare for potentially significant changes in the U.S. regulatory environment for business. And this is really on two fronts. The first is that President Trump plans to pursue a broad deregulatory agenda, lower taxes for business. It is also the case, however, that he plans to significantly cut the federal bureaucracy, which will limit the administration's capacity to introduce and implement new regulations. As they engage with or respond to the new administration, companies need to ensure that they're doing their homework. They need to prepare for a more complex investment landscape here in the U.S. as a result of political dysfunction, political polarization, and uncertainty over the long-term trajectory of U.S. foreign and domestic policy.
The genie is out of the lamp. There are certain actions by state actors that have been essentially taboo since World War II, and now they're enabled by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And if Russia did it, the other actors would consider maybe we should do something like that as well. Maybe that's a viable tool in our political arsenal. Clients across industries are worried about this because they understand the domino effect. You don't even need to be directly targeted by an escalation such as Russian sabotage in Europe to be affected. enough that your supply chain would be or your infrastructure would be. Because if there's one key takeaway from the Ukraine-Russia conflict, it is never to underestimate the outliers scenario.
Over the past year, we have seen several developments which have not been foreseen. There is obviously the question about how the tensions between Iran and Israel could escalate further. We have seen this tension result in direct attacks, but we don't know the scale to which these attacks could move forward.
In my part of the world here in Northeast Asia, the big problem really is nobody knows exactly where some of the red lines are, and everybody is trying to get as close to them as possible without triggering a crisis. Things have been happening in places like the Korean Peninsula and increasingly also the Taiwan Strait and the South China Sea that are quite dramatic escalations that in other contexts might look like the crossing of a red line or a clear crisis trigger. But people are getting used to these happening all the time.
One thing that clients are, very focused on in 2025 are the direction of U.S. sanctions and export controls. These have really raised a lot of compliance and regulatory obligations for multinational companies. They're concerned about the direction, or they're interested in the direction that these might go. Will they be further tightened, for example, on Iran, Venezuela, and Russia, or might they be alleviated as a result of political settlements in Ukraine and the Middle East?
The sanctions were originally a red line tool. They are meant to deter a country from crossing red lines, but they have always had an economic component to them. It was always important. It was always considered by the countries that impose them. And you prepare for sanctions risks by considering how these may affect your businesses, how you need to diversify, how you need to de-risk, how you need to maybe divest from certain partners, industries, jurisdictions.
It's important to be aware of different scenarios, the manner in which different crises can evolve with time, what the trigger points could be, what the potential flashpoints could be, and obviously what kind of an impact that would have on your operations in the region, and most importantly, what the contingency plans can be or what plan of action you can take for each of those scenarios.
In 2025, three trends are converging to increase the risk of a global trade war. The first is the protectionist response to China's economic policies, in particular, its export of its manufacturing surplus worldwide. The second is a more muscular U.S. trade policy that combines tariffs, export controls, and investment restrictions to position the U.S. as a more significant economic competitor. And the third is the global embrace of industrial policy, which signals more tolerance for government intervention in the economy as governments put significant resources behind developing their own domestic industries at the expense of international trade and supply chain relationships.
We're going to see an increase in US-China tensions, and increasingly that will involve third countries and multinationals being caught in the middle with conflicting political pressures and regulatory requirements. So I think companies that are maybe a little bit desensitized to this after years of US-China competition and geopolitical risk need to get ready for the next phase and the next level of that tension.
What types of industrial policies does the U.S. plan to pursue? What forms of economic stimulus will China use at home? And, where is the EU in terms of its regulatory environment?
One of the trends that we're noticing is even amongst more centrist political parties, they are increasingly taking ideas from the more populist end of the political spectrum, whether that's on migration policy, and we're seeing tightening up of visas, which can make it difficult for businesses to bring people into the country. It could be on things like industrial policy, trade policy, and being more protectionist in a sort of trying to put the nation's economy above the broader region and the rest of the world.
Governments in Asia Pacific will be watching the US closely to see to what extent it can and will remain steadfast on trade and security alliances in the region. At the same time, countries are going to be working towards securing their own strategic self-interests in anticipation of such unpredictabilities, which will likely take the form of deepening bilateral ties, regional alliances,
or multilateral groupings in 2025. Businesses should also be watching these movements closely to remain best prepared to mitigate risks arising out of potential regulatory and geopolitical shifts.
The first step for many organizations is really to understand their exposure and vulnerability to an escalation of trade tensions, right? Where is your supply chain? Who are your first and second tier suppliers? Mapping that supply chain, understanding its exposure to specific policy risks, that's really the first step.
Taking it back to Risk Management 101, we see increasing likelihood of political violence in 2025 across a diverse set of actors, coupled with increasing potential for outsized disruptive impacts across a number of key markets for businesses.
We are increasingly seeing activist groups that are directly targeting businesses, whether it be for their environmentalist credentials or lack thereof, whether it be for their perceived relationship with the conflicts that are going on in the region and beyond. And so for our clients, they're certainly concerned about the physical threats to their personnel and their assets. And then there's the broader political stability angle. And there are real concerns that the political atmosphere is increasing the potential for violence against elected representatives and others involved in the political environment.
Cyber attacks that Indian government organizations and India-based commercial organizations have faced up to 3 times more than the global average. Commercial airliners in India over the last month have faced a host of threats that have been bomb hoaxes, which are driven by international interests. These are all a broadening arena of political violence.
We've very much seen a trend in recent years already that most attacks are carried out by individuals. They may have links to extremist groups, or they may certainly have been inspired by extremist groups. But because of the increased capabilities of the security services in Europe, it has been very difficult for networks to develop and carry out attacks. And so we certainly think that that trend will be one that continues in the coming year, whereby attacks are most likely to be unsophisticated, carried out by individuals, and most likely against targets that have very little in the way of security measures in place.
The evolution of social media and spheres of influence online, the prevalence of disinformation, the arrival of deepfakes on the scene, which have continued to trigger and to both cause and lead to violence across the world. The question of agency and mitigation in this space is probably one which is making a lot of our clients think about redefining the way they manage risks.
So disinformation certainly plays a role in the radicalization of individuals, but it also is increasingly playing a role in the aftermath of attacks, where there are questions about what may have motivated an attack. People are very quickly putting out misinformation and disinformation that leads members of the public to believe something about that attack that may or may not be true.
Of course, we can't talk about political violence without talking about some of the economic crises and stresses that are driving personal and political grievances. That goes back to the global financial crisis more than 15 years ago, but more recently, of course, the COVID pandemic, which was an economic shock as much as it was a public health shock.
I think what's critical about digital risks in 2025 and this challenge of ecosystem concentration is it is forcing executives and strategic decision makers in organizations to rethink their own ability and their own agency over both managing risks as well as the strategic impact of the decisions they're taking today for the long run. We are seeing businesses realize the fact that interconnectivity, although a net benefit to their businesses, is proving challenging from a risk management perspective. As these ecosystems continue to concentrate and converge, we are expecting to see the ability for companies to shift from one to the other to be increasingly difficult and challenging.
Companies need to be more flexible and adaptable.
And that may seem trite, given everything else, but today companies need to kind of drill a little bit deeper and look at multiple scenarios, at more diverse and more unpredictable threats, and actually have what-if mechanisms that allow their businesses to move rapidly in the event of such events coming to pass. And that is a very significant transition.
When we look at the choices that we are making today, whether going with a specific cloud provider or deploying a specific type of large language models, partnering with one organization to develop our artificial intelligence capabilities in our businesses, these choices will have long-lasting consequences on our businesses.
We're also seeing increased volume and convergence of digital and online threats, such that it's becoming increasingly difficult to find that proverbial needle in a haystack, or to assess credible threats rapidly enough to be able to intervene and act.
Over the last 5 years, India has seen the development of a rather enviable payment interface and authentication capability based on biometrics and driven by a unified payment interface that allows for everything from authentication, financial transactions, direct benefit transfers, citizen services, all of which are delivered against a single unified India tech stack. As great as that is, it also creates a very significant single point of failure, because that particular tech stack is one of the very significant targets that threat actors, international threat actors, cyber threat actors are acting against.
The opportunities are plentiful. When we look at the opportunities that are tied with digital technologies more broadly, it's almost unquantifiable the scale at which they are present today and they will most likely materialize in the near future. In part, that is because of this concentration that's occurred. In part, that is because the cost of technology is lower. But that is fundamentally one of the greatest sources of risks ahead.